Only in the public sector would rising revenue or income or profits be considered a shortfall. I said in family budgets and business budgets in the private sector, anybody who has rising revenue knows that it's simply a matter of controlling their spending.
You're hearing the voice of Paul Guppy there, a senior researcher at the Washington Policy Center, discussing the recent news about a major budget deficit for the state of Washington. What is the story behind this $10 to $12 billion shortfall we've seen in the news? Why is the governor calling for a hiring freeze? And what can we expect from his budget proposal later on this month? Plus, what kind of bills will the legislature be looking at in a few weeks when that session starts up? And we voted yes on I-2066, the natural gas measure. But is that really the end of the story? All this and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are mine. My co-host David Croman is on leave, so we are getting a preview of coming attractions in the state capitol this week with the help of Paul Queary, who is the editor and publisher of the Washington State Observer. Paul, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Brian.
I hear your coworker in the background barking, so I know we're in good shape here. I love it. I love it. Thanks a lot, Paul. Thanks for doing this. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to my show patrons who contribute to the show, get their questions answered on the show, access to patrons first content as well, a whole lot more. So check it out on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Get signed up, and we'll even send you this very snazzy looking decal too. Very cool. So a big thanks also, in addition, to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get her going here. Time for Right Here, Right Now. A quick heads up here, folks. A Seattle City Council bombshell this week, just before recording this podcast. Councilmember Tammy Morales is resigning effective January of next year. I'm going to work on getting more details to you soon. But one of the big reasons I wanted to connect with Paul this week is that the council has just put out its state legislative agenda. They do this every year. In it, a lot of requests we've seen before. Requests to end the state preemption on cities enacting their own gun laws, lifting the cap on city property taxes, issues not likely to get a lot of traction in Olympia. And that's at least in part because apparently our state has a $10 to $12 billion deficit to deal with, according to its most recent 4-year outlook. This was reported, Paul, in the Observer and other outlets, and I think it's really significant when you consider our state's 2-year budget is around the $71 billion range. So I just wanted to get a backgrounder here. How did our state end up in this hole, Paul, and why do we have this deficit?
You know, there's been a lot of aggressive spending in recent years. There have been a lot of adoptions of new programs with sort of expensive, kind of bow waves of spending. I think that, the one that the Observer's annual Rewire Policy Conference was yesterday. And one of the subjects that really came up there was spending for education and especially early learning and childcare.
Right.
That's a recent addition to the state budget, a big increase in state support for childcare and early learning. That was one of the kind of justifications for passing the capital gains tax, was to help pay for that. Mm-hmm. And that stuff, that and other things get very expensive in the coming years. And that's, contributed to the budget deficit, or to the looming budget deficit. It hasn't actually happened yet. And some of that's by design. I think that you have an increasingly aggressive progressive majority in the legislature, and they have, spending priorities. And there are also many lawmakers who believe that the tax structure should be, substantially reformed to both to make it more fair and to provide more money for various state services. And so I think there was a little bit of kind of betting on the come going on here in this, in the sense that, we will build it and then we'll figure out how we're going to pay for it later.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying on that one. And I wanted to dive in a little bit further onto what was talked about at that Rewire Policy Conference that you mentioned there earlier, because you talked about what was happening with education, and I saw it in the Observer as well. Chris Rakedahl, the superintendent of public instruction, asking for $3 billion more for public schools in the budget. And I'm just trying to look at this because I'm really trying to figure out how the governor, how the legislature are going to approach this deficit. Is it time to make some serious cuts? I know the governor's talking about a hiring freeze, or I'm kind of taking the flip on this. Are lawmakers going to be emboldened by these votes in the November election to uphold the capital gains tax with 2109? They rejected that. To maintain long-term health care with 2124, they rejected that. And does that give lawmakers this idea, hey, maybe we should be going after more revenue? Where do you expect this budget discussion, when it comes to revenue especially, where do you expect it to go in the coming year?
Yeah, I mean, I had the leaders of the legislature in the final panel at Rewire last night, which you can
Great.
find on TVW if you're into that kind of thing.
Sure.
And I think the answer to that is there will probably be a lot of, talk about cutting the budget, but ultimately I think this is going to be more about new revenue. And I mean, essentially increased taxation to pay for these things. I look at the majorities in the House and the Senate, and I don't see a lot of votes to cut the budget, and I see a lot of votes to raise taxes. So I would expect that there will be some of both, but I think the focus is going to be on finding new revenue.
Do you have any idea where that new revenue could come from? I know we've been talking a lot about capital gains, and what's next?
Folks were cagey about that. We had April Berg, who's the chair of the House Finance Committee, who's sort of in charge of finding the new money, if that's what they need. And she was talking about wanting to tax wealth and not work. The leaders were kind of cagey when I tried to pin them down on that, but I think you could see some kind of wealth tax. There are areas of the economy that aren't really touched very well by the sales tax.
Okay.
There are a lot of services that aren't subject to the sales tax, and you might, there's been talk of expanding that. I think people are interested in a state version of the Jumpstart tax that you have in Seattle,
right?
Which is and effectively a progressive tax that's
on big businesses,
right? Court challenge, and I know that there's been some leakage out of Seattle with, kind of high wage work, moving to Bellevue and other places.
Sure.
And
right.
This would be a way of capturing that. I mean, they'd have to figure out kind of how to hold Seattle harmless on that.
Right.
But
right.
I think that there'll be a variety of, of proposals floated, and what exactly they settle on is going to be a really interesting idea. And it could be a really big year for that kind of thing. This is they're both, the Democratic majorities are larger.
Right.
You have a new governor who doesn't have to run for re-election for, until 2028.
Yeah. Right.
There's never going to be a better year if you're going to go big on that kind of stuff.
Right.
Normally you would expect, some kind of midterm loss 2 years from now. Like the majorities might, they might lose a few seats. I'm not sure exactly where they would, but so, I mean, if you're going to raise taxes and do stuff that might generally be considered unpopular, next year's the year to do it,
I suppose. Wow. I wanted to keep on going down that path with you, Paul, because the balance of power, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit further with you here in a minute, but I want to talk about the kind of bills we might see from Olympia next year. 22 of them have been pre-filed this week as of the recording of this podcast. I've seen a lot of focus on Senator Phil Fortunato, the Republican from the 31st District down in Auburn. He's got this push to end Washington's sanctuary state status in line with what President-elect Donald Trump has planned with mass deportations, etc. I wanted to touch on this, Paul. Where do you see this issue going?
So Senator Fortunato is among the most conservative members of the Republican minority, and he files a lot of bills, and most of them don't get a lot of traction.
Right.
So I would kind of tend to assume that that's what's going to happen here.
Okay.
I think you'll see a lot. I think you're much more likely to see kind of the opposite reaction from the legislature in terms of things that push back either symbolically or materially against the Trump administration.
Okay. And let me keep on going, please.
I looked at the pre-file. I haven't seen anything super consequential in the pre-filed bill list yet. I mean, that you usually see some really interesting stuff at some point during December. But a lot of that is you have members of the legislature kind of running their proposals through the code revisor's office, and the order in which they arrive is sometimes a little bit random, sometimes not. And and I think that we tend as reporters to react a little bit to those proposals without considering the context of whether they're likely to get a hearing or
Fair.
or whatever. So I didn't see anything
Nothing jumped out at you
yet, but
yeah, I noticed that too, and it's just and I hear what you're saying about the order of these bills, because it looked like one of the first ones that was out of the chute from the House, at least, was this bill from Representative Jim Walsh down from the 19th district, southwest corner of Washington, wants tougher sentences on people who deliver or distribute fentanyl. And I'm wondering, on an issue like this one, I know we introduced this last year, didn't go anywhere, but when you see that fentanyl overdose deaths have continued to rise in Washington state as they have declined in other parts of the country, is now the time for this to get another hearing? I wanted to throw that out there too. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fentanyl crisis is a real thing, and there's a broad division of ideas about how to deal with that. I don't know that there's a ton of enthusiasm in the current legislature for what you might think of as a traditional law and order approach to that.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's an interesting one too. But I know that I know there's a few other bills out there. Anything else on your radar? It didn't sound like there was too much in terms of those pre-filed bills out there.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really seen. I think we'll see some things that we've seen in recent years reemerge. I think you'll see another push to kind of reform and restructure the recycling system, which was a big fight last year.
Yep.
That versions of that bill have died in each of the last two sessions. So I think you'll see that. I think you'll see more housing related bills.
Sure.
The rent stabilization bill that failed last year, that passed the House and then failed in the Senate, that's certainly going to be back. We had Representative Alvarado was the sponsor of that bill at the Rewire conference yesterday, and she's spoiling for that fight again. And the Senate the current Senate is more favorable than last year's Senate for that, so I would kind of expect that bill to have traction. And there are other proposals about making it easier to develop market rate housing in various ways that have run into opposition from local governments in recent years. And we're going to see more of that, definitely.
Okay. Well, great. Paul, thank you for that full breakdown there. Well, coming up next, we're going to dive into a little bit further this whole issue of the balance of power in Olympia. It's shifted even further left as Democrats have taken over every statewide position while also establishing larger majorities in the House and Senate. How will that affect the upcoming legislative session? We're going to talk about it coming up on Now Hear This. Well, in the aftermath of Election Day, the data shows Washington state defiantly blue up against a Republican wave across the nation. Well, our state swung even further left in 2024. Dems now hold every major executive statewide office and have flipped some Republican seats in the legislature as well to grow their majorities in the House and Senate. Outgoing Governor Jay Inslee says it's a vote of confidence.
To some degree, elections are referendums on the direction that your state is going. I think the fact that we now apparently have elected all Democrats to statewide positions is an affirmation that our state is heading in the right direction.
Paul, what's your take on the gains Democrats made in Washington state this year? How did they do it?
So you've got really the only material gain. I mean, they had all those statewide offices before, so it's not like they took anything back from the Republicans.
Okay.
They picked up one seat in the House and one seat in the Senate, and I would say that those are reflective of pretty conservative candidates running in open races. So in the House, you had former Representative Jesse Young, who was one of the most conservative members of the House when he was there and widely disliked among his own caucus, lost to Addison Richards, I believe his name is, in the 26th which is the Kitsap Peninsula, sort of Gig Harbor to Bremerton. That's very much a swing district. A more kind of moderate mainstream Republican might well have won that race. Similarly, in the 18th district, which is sort of the North Vancouver suburbs, you had an open seat Brad Benton, who is the son of former Senator Don Benton, who, readers and listeners may be familiar with from back in the day. He beat a more moderate Republican, Greg Cheney, in the primary, and then lost very narrowly to Democrat Adrian Cortez in the general election. So that's the one seat on both sides, and you could easily see with different candidates those elections going in different ways. In theory, the practical result of that is Democrats have the lesser of two supermajority advantages in the legislature now, which theoretically allows them to issue debt to pass capital budgets and transportation budgets without Republican votes. Again, I had the leaders of the legislature at the Rewire conference yesterday, and they said that they don't have any plans to do that.
Okay.
They plan to pursue the sort of traditional bipartisan compromise on those.
Okay.
On those issues. So the question of whether it's really a lot further left, I think, is kind of open. The House has been pretty progressive and restless for several years now.
Okay.
The Senate has kind of been restrained by some moderates with real power and influence in the caucus, particularly on the Ways and Means Committee, which is
it sounded like there's maybe a shift in Ways and Means a little bit. What's going on there?
There is a shift. Two of the more moderate sort of pro-business senators did not seek re-election this year. Mark Mullet ran for governor,
right?
And Kevin Vandeweghe ran for Commissioner of Public Lands. Both of them lost in the primary,
right?
And also the larger Democratic majority in the Senate sort of prompted the majority to rejigger the Ways and Means Committee. So the Democrats have another vote, which makes it theoretically easier for progressive stuff to get through that committee. Okay. And also the folks who replaced Vandeweghe and Mullet on that committee are definitely sort of more, what you might think of as in the progressive wing of the Democrats. So in theory, that's going to make it easier for some of the stuff that's died in that committee to live on. But in practice, one of that committee's roles is to kill stuff that the state can't afford yet.
Right.
And, given the aforementioned budget problem, that might still be the case. Right.
Okay.
I mean, that's where the $200 million ideas go to die. And,
right. We'll see what shakes out there. Well, maybe you can take me to the flip side here, Paul. Talk to me about the GOP and its future in Olympia, because I think there were some candidates that were a little bit further on the fringe of the right wing there, and they got in office despite a lot of spending from the traditional GOP to try to keep them out. What's going on with the GOP at the state level when it comes to Olympia?
Yeah, and I think you definitely had some sort of conservative on moderate fights in the primary and then in the general election, notably in the second, which is sort of rural Thurston and Pierce County. A seat formerly held by former minority leader J.T. Wilcox went to Matt Miller, who is actually, I think I might be getting his name wrong. Went to a far right candidate who, despite having very little money, beat the former sheriff of Thurston County pretty soundly in the general election in a Republican on Republican fight. Mm-hmm. And then you had another kind of far right lawmaker, Rob Chase, out in, I believe, the 4th legislative district in Spokane County.
Right. Mm-hmm.
He had been ousted in the previous election by a more moderate Republican who ran for state Senate. And so Rob Chase got back in. So that, and that was and in general, and we talked about Jesse Young, the Republican caucus in the House was behind his Republican opponent in the primary, who wound up losing. So you have a situation where the Republican caucus in the House kind of ticked to the right a little bit, and kind of against its will, right? They were spending money to try and influence those elections, and it didn't work. So like, what does that mean for them? I think that, probably there'll be a little tension in the caucus room,
Yeah.
But, and, every seat they lose makes it harder for them to play defense.
Right.
In because and just sort of generally emboldens the progressives, because now that on both sides of the rotunda, the Democratic caucuses can lose a sort of substantial number of their members on controversial bills and still pass them.
Right. Right.
So,
Okay.
I mean, I think that I know there's a lot of soul searching going on among, sort of leading Republicans and sort of, the folks who write a lot of checks on that side of the political spectrum.
Sure.
Sort of where do we go from here? Because,
Yeah.
they got pretty well shellacked up and down the, certainly in the statewide offices.
Right.
The governor's race was lopsided. The attorney general's race was lopsided.
Mm-hmm.
The Jamie Herrera Butler.
Yeah, even that public lands, right? Yeah.
Best hope, ultimately wound up losing to Dave Upthegrove in the Commissioner for Public Lands race. So it's like, where do they go? I think is a real question. And while the whole Washington didn't go right like the rest of the country, was maybe a little overblown on election night. The results are coming in a little bit different. I think that definitely Donald Trump was still a drag on the ticket here, on the Republican ticket here. And, also we just have and have had for years a pretty substantial structural advantage for Democrats at the statewide level.
Yeah.
And the trend at the sort of legislative district level looks like that, that's a pretty substantial advantage for Democrats as well. I mean, there are a lot of places that were formerly swing districts,
Sure.
that now look pretty safely Democratic.
Got it. And just a quick correction there. That's Matt Marshall in District 2
Yes.
there who won that race. I want to make sure we
Yes, absolutely.
got that correct there. Just one thought to wrap this up, Paul. I've been asked this by so many people who live in our state and live outside of our state. Is it healthy politically to have such a strong position of one party rule when you look at it in our state? What do you think about that?
I think a lot of people would argue, and I might tend to agree, that it puts too much pressure on the primary, which, where turnout's really low.
Yeah.
The governor's race was basically decided in August.
Yeah.
And that was true for the most part of the statewide offices. And so you have I think you can make a real argument that a lot of folks, got to November and maybe didn't, may not have seen, the choices that they wanted on the ballot. And
Right.
So I think that's, that's kind of an interesting question. And that gets you toward, issues of kind of election system reform, like ranked choice voting and things like that might sort of get you a little more diversity of candidates in front of the electorate as a whole.
I see. It's a big question to consider, but I appreciate you grappling with it, because it's I don't know. I think it's something that voters are looking at as they look up and down the ballot there, and the health of the GOP in our state. It just doesn't feel like it's in a great spot right now. So,
and it's also like there's a real advantage to incumbency and sort of what we might think of as sort of prior incumbency. So, for example, attorney general is a great race to run for governor from.
Yeah, right.
I mean, a great place to run for
Stepping
governor
stone, right. Mm-hmm.
And Bob Ferguson, the current attorney general and the governor-elect, has effectively been running for governor for at least 8 years.
Yeah, sure.
Arguably as long as 12 years. He had an enormous fundraising advantage, from the beginning. And, the weight of the office kind of at his disposal to build his political brand and
Sure.
His name recognition around the state. And that is extremely difficult to combat.
Right.
And if you add it to the Democrats' structural advantage, it just, made him into kind of a juggernaut for the general election.
Certainly
And
came across
like,
that.
how do you deal with that? I mean, like, that's a thing in many states. And you have to look at it right now. I mean, Nick Brown, who was just elected Attorney General, looks like the instant favorite for higher office, for 8 or however many years down the road.
Right.
And,
Right.
If you're the Republicans, that's a deep hole to climb out of. If you don't have a prominent office to run from, when you're running from higher office, it's just hard to, it's hard to crack that.
Yep. Hear you loud and clear on that. All right. Well, we need to start wrapping up here, but we're going to first look at the future of I-2066, the natural gas bill. Voters said yes to it, but that's not the end of the story. We're going to tell you more coming up on What's Next. Well, Paul, the final election numbers will be certified this week. More than 51% of voters in Washington state said yes to I-2066, which rolled back restrictions on natural gas. But as I'm reading in The Observer, this isn't the end of the story. What's going on here?
Well, there's a sort of inevitable legal challenge here. The opponents of 2066, which I think we can describe as sort of the environmental community writ large, argue that the initiative violates the single subject rule, which is a rule in the Constitution that ballot initiatives and also things that come out of the legislature are supposed to be only about one thing.
Yeah. This brought down a lot of IMIN initiatives in the past.
Right. And the High Court has typically been pretty stringent about applying that rule to ballot initiatives, less so things that come out of the legislature.
Yes.
So that might, we had a forum about this at Rewire yesterday.
Oh, good. Okay.
And the Building Industry Association of Washington's counsel was there, and she was the original drafter and sponsor of that initiative, and she seemed pretty confident that it's going to stand up. So, we'll see about that. If it holds up, then that is generally going to put a sort of at least a 2-year hold on, further legislation
changes to the code
on,
or whatever,
rolling back natural gas for the most part. I mean, that's one of the benefits of passing an initiative is that in order for the legislature to overturn any part of it, they would need a supermajority, which they don't have on this issue. So, I mean, that the most material thing that initiative did was pave over the Washington State Building Code Council, which enacted some new codes recently that effectively ban gas-fired furnaces and water heaters in new construction of houses.
Right. Yeah. Seattle did that recently too. Keep going.
Right. And it also, the initiative also paves over the local government's attempts to do that.
Right.
And so, and there's some other questions about exactly what the implications of it are going forward. But those were the main parts of it. That it theoretically targeted a bill that was designed to help Puget Sound Energy move its customers from gas to electricity.
Right.
The degree to which that bill got substantially watered down before it was passed last year. So the degree that it causes Puget Sound Energy a lot of trouble is a little up in the air right now.
Yeah. So interesting to see how this is going to play out. But it's clear that nothing's going to be rushed through. I know the BIAW is saying, "Hey, come on now, Building Code Council, let's make some big changes here." But they're not rushing to do that. I think we're still waiting for a lot of the legal arguments to settle here.
And certainly the building codes, I mean, part of the backstory of this whole thing is that the governor stacked the Building Codes Council to do this.
Yes.
In the first place. And they have argued the codes in question are actually about energy efficiency, not specifically about technology.
Right.
And they argue, or at least, the relevant architect who serves on the Building Codes Council argues that the initiative doesn't even apply because it's about energy efficiency and not about fuel. So, you can expect that part of it to sort of, play out in the courts and in the regulatory realm for months.
Indeed. All right. Well, this story is definitely not done. Paul, thank you so much for doing this. I did need to wrap up with you. I had one last question for you. The most satisfying part of your work, is it reporting on the latest breaking details of state government or supplying your readers with quality dog photos? Just wanted to throw that out there.
So for your folks who haven't looked at the Observer, we run a picture usually of my black lab Arya at the end of it, and I think it's absolutely clear that the newsletter would be more successful if it was only about Arya.
Your co-worker and your co-sponsor sounds like that.
Yes.
That's great. Paul, I appreciate it all. The dog photos, all of it. If you haven't checked out the Washington Observer, folks, make sure you do it. Paul, very much appreciate you being on the podcast.
All right. Happy to be with you, Brian.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Thanks to everybody who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. If you're not a patron, please support the show for just $5 a month. Find this podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2024.